They had her by the shoulders before she could stand on her own. 2 flight attendants and a man in a suit. 3 sets of hands on a woman who was not resisting, who was not speaking, who was sitting in seat 2C with her back straight and her chin level and her hands folded in her lap with the particular stillness of someone who has decided that dignity costs nothing and she intends to keep every cent of it. The German shepherd at her feet had not moved. He was pressed flat against the floor of the first-class cabin with his chin on his forepaws and his amber eyes tracking every person in that aisle with an attention so precise and so complete that the flight attendants were stepping around him rather than through him, which they were doing instinctively without quite knowing why. The man in the suit said something. His voice was low and final and carried the particular tone of authority delivered by someone who has never had it questioned. The dog heard it. His ears came forward. Nobody else in the cabin moved. The man in seat 3A had been watching since the moment the suit appeared at the front of the aircraft. He had not moved. He had not spoken. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 41 years learning the difference between the moment to act and the moment to wait. And he understood with complete clarity that the moment had not yet arrived. It arrived when they put their hands on her shoulders. Before we go further, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Subscribe and stay until the very end. What the man in seat 3A said when he stood up, and what it cost one corporate vice president before that plane reached Charlotte, is a story this country needed to hear. We read every single comment, and we want to know how far this travels. Fleet Admiral James Weston, United States Navy, was 63 years old and carried the weight of 41 years of commissioned service the way old mountains carry their age. Not in excess, not in display, but in the particular settled density of something that has been compressed by time and force into a form that does not yield easily to anything. He was 6 feet tall and lean in the way of men who have kept moving long past the age when most men have stopped. With close-cropped silver hair and a face that had been tanned and lined by decades of shipboard weather and foreign latitudes, into something that was less handsome than it was authoritative. Not the manufactured authority of titles and uniforms, but the organic kind. The kind that accumulates in the eyes of someone who has made decisions that could not be unmade, and has lived with every one of them. His eyes were a clear, pale blue-gray, almost colorless in certain lights, and they moved through any space he occupied with the unhurried completeness of someone who has spent 4 decades being responsible for everything in his field of view. He was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a navy blue wool jacket, no insignia, no flag, nothing that identified him to the flight attendants who had greeted him at the boarding door as anything other than a well-dressed older gentleman in 3A who had declined the offer of a pre-departure beverage and spent the first 40 minutes of the flight reading a paperback copy of Grant's memoirs. He did not fly on government aircraft when his schedule permitted civilian travel. He had never believed that 4 stars entitled him to comfort that his sailors could not afford, and he had said so, in those exact words, to 3 different chiefs of naval operations across 4 decades, and he had meant it each time, and his travel records confirmed that he had lived it. He was on this flight, oared to Charlotte Douglas, morning departure November, because he was going to Camp Lejeune for a base visit that did not require the apparatus of official travel, and because he had an early meeting the following morning, and because seat 3A on the 715 was the most efficient way to get from one to the other. He had been traveling this way since he was a captain. He saw no reason to change it now. He had noticed the woman in 2C when she boarded. He noticed most things. She was in her late 30s, compact and deliberate in her movements, with the posture of someone who has carried things at altitude for a long time and whose spine has adapted to the requirement. She had a service dog vest on the German Shepherd, large, black and tan, moving with the low-controlled patience of a dog with operational history, and she had produced her documentation for the gate agent at O'Hare without being asked, with the automatic efficiency of someone who has learned to get ahead of the question. The gate agent had accepted it. She had boarded. She had settled into 2C with the dog positioned flat beside her feet. And she had not spoken to anyone. And she had not asked for anything. And she had held herself with the complete, quiet self-possession of someone who knows exactly where they are going and why, and who needs nothing from the people around them to confirm it. He had noticed the man in the suit board 12 minutes later. He had noticed because the suit moved through the boarding door the way certain kinds of institutional authority always moved, scanning the cabin not to assess but to evaluate, measuring the people in it not for threat but for relevance. He had taken a seat toward the rear of first class and had spent the first 20 minutes of the flight on his phone, speaking in the low but unhurried voice of a man who is accustomed to being overheard and considers it appropriate. His name was Clifton Drake, and he was the Regional Vice President of Operations for Pinnacle Air's Midwest and Southeast Corridor, which meant that he controlled scheduling, crew assignments, gate operations, and, as he understood it, anything that happened on any aircraft operating under his authority in those regions. He was 51 years old and had spent 19 years building a career on the specific combination of procedural knowledge and social aggression that the airline industry rewarded at certain levels, and that he had learned to deploy with the confidence of someone who has never been told no by anyone whose no actually mattered. He had a wife in Naperville and a lake house in Michigan, and a history of formal complaints, 3 of them filed by passengers in the past 4 years, that had gone nowhere, because they had been filed against the airline and he was the airline, or near enough, and the internal review process had found, each time, that his actions had been within operational guidelines. He had wide shoulders and a wide face and a handshake that was slightly too firm and eyes that moved to the next person before the current conversation was complete. Because the current conversation was rarely the most important one in the room. He had complained about the dog 17 minutes into the flight, not to a flight attendant, to the senior cabin crew member directly, and not as a passenger complaint, but as a VP communication, which was a different category with a different implied consequence. He had said the dog was encroaching on the aisle. He had said it was a safety issue. He had said he had authority over cabin configurations on Pinnacle aircraft, and that the animal needed to be secured in the cargo hold, or the passenger removed to economy. He had said this with complete calm and the specific tone of a man issuing an instruction rather than making a request. And the senior crew member had gone pale, and gone to the front galley, and made a call, and come back with 2 other attendants, in the beginning of what was happening now. Steele had not moved when the attendants arrived. He was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, 82 pounds, with a coat of deep black and rich tan that lay close against his body in the particular way of working dogs whose fur has been kept field practical rather than show-groomed, and whose density carried a warmth that the woman beside him felt against her leg even through the fabric of her slacks. He had a scar along his right flank that ran diagonally from his rib cage toward his hip, shrapnel, Mosul, 2008, from an eye that had killed the interpreter walking 3 feet ahead of them, and from which Steele had recovered completely except for the scar, and a slight weather sensitivity in that flank that his veterinarian noted and that Steele himself gave no indication of treating as anything other than a fact. He moved through enclosed spaces with the deliberate awareness of an animal that has spent serious time in environments where the difference between a cleared room and an uncleared one was the difference between coming home and not, and he brought that awareness to every space he entered, including the first-class cabin of a commercial aircraft, which he had assessed in the first 40 seconds after boarding and found to present no immediate operational concerns. He had settled at Maya's feet and stayed there, because that was where he was needed, and because he did not move from where he was needed until the situation changed. The situation had changed. He pressed closer against Maya's leg, not rising, not tensing, simply becoming more present, the way a load-bearing wall becomes more present when the structure above it shifts. Her name was Maya Holt. She was 38 years old, a sergeant first class in the United States Army, retired, who had served 8 years with the 10th Mountain Division out of Fort Drum, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan, 1 to Syria, and who had come home from the last one with a Bronze Star, a Combat Action Badge, and a traumatic brain injury from a vehicle blast outside Kandahar in 2019 that had required 9 months of inpatient rehabilitation, and that she carried now in the form of chronic migraines, light sensitivity, and the particular kind of exhaustion that the brain imposes when it is working harder than it appears to. B. She had adopted Steele 18 months after her medical retirement through the military working dog program. And she had spent the subsequent 3 years learning how to live inside the limitations of a life that had been rebuilt from partial materials, and she had done it with a stubbornness and precision that 8 years of infantry service had built into her at a cellular level. She worked at the Bozeman Grill in Bozeman, Montana. She had been working there for 2 years, 5 days a week, double shifts when her head allowed it. She had saved for this ticket for 22 months. Her son, Private First Class Darius Holt, was graduating from Marine Corps boot camp at Parris Island on Saturday, and she was going to be there. She had called ahead about Steele. She had confirmed with the airline's disability services line. She had the documentation in a folder in the outer pocket of her carry-on, and she had produced it without hesitation when the gate agent asked. And the gate agent had said everything was in order, and had waved her through. She had been in this seat for 40 minutes, hurting nobody, asking for nothing, watching the clouds outside the window, and thinking about her son's face when he would see her in the crowd. When the attendants arrived and told her she needed to remove the dog, she had asked why, quietly, without raising her voice. Nobody had been able to give her an answer that was true. Steele pressed harder against her leg. His eyes were on the aisle. She stood because they were telling her to stand, and because she had been in enough situations where compliance was the only strategy that kept the situation from becoming something worse. And because her documentation was in order and she believed, in the way that people who have served their country believe things, that order mattered, and that things done correctly would come out correctly in the end. She stood with the controlled steadiness of someone absorbing something unjust and choosing not to give the injustice the satisfaction of her distress. Her chin was level. Her eyes were forward. Drake had moved into the aisle. He was standing 4 feet back with the expression of someone watching a process he has initiated reach its conclusion. And the expression was not triumphant and not cruel. It was simply satisfied. The satisfaction of a man who has exercised authority and found it functioning correctly. Steele growled. It was low, and it was single, and it was not loud. But in the pressurized quiet of the first-class cabin at 34,000 feet, it carried the way sound carries in enclosed spaces, completely, with nowhere to go, filling the air until every person in those seats had heard it. The flight attendant nearest Drake took 1 half-step sideways without deciding to. The man in seat 3A closed his book. He stood up. Fleet Admiral James Weston stood up in the aisle of a Pinnacle Air first-class cabin, and nothing about the way he stood was dramatic, and nothing about the way he moved was aggressive. And nobody in that cabin who saw him rise could have said why the cabin went completely silent, except that it did. The way a room goes silent when it recognizes, before it understands, that the most important person present has just made himself known. He looked at Drake. "My name is James Weston," he said. "Fleet Admiral, United States Navy. I am the senior military officer of the United States Navy, and I have been in this cabin for 40 minutes watching you instruct your crew to remove a decorated United States Army veteran and her service animal from a seat she legally and correctly obtained, using documentation your own gate agent accepted at the door." His voice was level and unhurried, and it filled the cabin without effort the way the voices of men who have commanded ships and squadrons fill spaces, because they have spent decades speaking to people who needed to hear them clearly, and have learned not to waste volume on things that can be accomplished with precision. "The Air Carrier Access Act," he continued, "prohibits exactly what is happening in this aisle right now. This veteran's documentation was valid. Your agent accepted it. Your crew has no lawful basis for this removal, and you know it." He paused for exactly one beat. "I need you to sit down, and I need your crew to stand down, and I need this woman to return to her seat." Drake looked at him. His jaw was set, and his eyes were doing the rapid calculation of a man who is accustomed to being the authority in any room and is encountering, for the first time in a very long time, an authority that his title cannot reach. "Sir," Drake said, "I have operational. You have a title," the Admiral said. "This woman has a bronze star. I need you to understand what that means, and I need you to sit down." The cabin was absolutely silent. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then, one of the flight attendants stepped back. Then, the second. Then Drake, with the careful deliberateness of a man who is retreating and is attempting to make it look like a decision rather than a defeat, turned and walked back to his seat. Steele's tail moved, once slow, the same deliberate arc that told anyone watching that the animal understood the position was no longer contested. Maya looked at the Admiral. He met her eyes. "Please sit down, Sergeant," he said. "You've got a graduation to get to." She sat down. Nobody in first class spoke for a long time after that. The man near the galley curtain, a retired school teacher from Rockford named Gary, who had been holding his water cup without drinking from it for the last 4 minutes, set it down very carefully on the armrest tray. Somewhere in the middle rows, a woman who had heard everything through the thin partition between cabins began crying quietly in the way people cry when something unjust has been made right, and they did not know until this moment how much they had needed to see it. The Admiral sat back down and reopened his book. He did not look at Drake again. He did not need to. Before the wheels touched Charlotte Douglas International, Admiral Weston had drafted the complaint on his phone, addressed personally to the Secretary of Transportation, the airline's chairman of the board, and the FAA's Aviation Consumer Protection Division. He had documented the seat number, the departure time, the crew members present, and Drake's full name as stated in the VP introduction that Drake had given the senior crew member, which Weston had overheard from seat 3A without trying. He had quoted the relevant sections of the Air Carrier Access Act from memory, because 41 years of commanding things had required him to know the laws that governed the people in his charge, and he had extended that habit, without announcement, to the laws that governed everyone else. The complaint was transmitted from his phone at 11:47 in the morning, 7 minutes before landing. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the airline's public affairs office had received calls from 3 journalists. By 9 o'clock that evening, the story was on the national wire. By the following morning, Pinnacle Air's chairman had personally reviewed the complaint, the crew's radio communications from the flight, and a photograph taken by a passenger in seat 5B that showed Admiral Weston standing in the aisle with the particular quality of presence that only 4-star officers and very old mountains possess. And that told everyone who saw it exactly what kind of man had been sitting in 3A. Clifton Drake was placed on administrative leave pending review on the morning of the third day. The review took 11 days and was, by all internal accounts, thorough. He was terminated from his position as Regional VP of Operations before the 2-week mark. The airline issued a formal public statement of apology, not a press release, a statement, and announced within 30 days the creation of a standing review committee for service animal accommodation policies, staffed in part by veterans advocacy organizations. Drake's 3 prior complaints, previously buried, were reopened and reviewed. 2 of the 3 resulted in settlements. Maya Holt was in the stands at Paris Island on Saturday morning when Private First Class Darius Holt marched across the parade deck in dress uniform. And she stood in the South Carolina November sun with steel at her left side, and her chin up, and her son's name in her heart, the way his name had always been there. Certain and permanent and worth every mile and every saved dollar, and every morning she had gotten up when the head was bad and the light was wrong, and she had done it anyway. Darius found her in the crowd after the ceremony, and he did not say anything for a moment, just held her. And Steele pressed against both of them with the patient warmth of an animal that understands, without instruction, what the moment requires. She sent a letter to Admiral Weston 3 weeks after the flight. He wrote back. The letter he sent was 2 paragraphs. The first thanked her for her service. The second said, simply, that what she had done that morning by sitting still and staying calm and refusing to be diminished had required more courage than most people are ever called to demonstrate, and that he hoped she knew it. She kept the letter. She did not frame it. She folded it and put it in the same drawer where she kept Darius's first-grade drawings, because that was the drawer for things that mattered. And it mattered. Admiral Weston retired from active duty 8 months later at a ceremony at the Washington Navy Yard with the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy in attendance, and 300 sailors who had served under his command at various points in 41 years, and a speech that ran 11 minutes and made no mention of an aircraft or a woman in Seat 2C or a dog named Steele, because the Admiral did not consider what had happened on that flight to be a thing worth commemorating. It was simply something he had done because it needed doing, and he was there, and he was capable of doing it, which was the same reason he had done everything else in 41 years, and he saw no reason to make a production of consistency. Steele's tail wagged every morning when Maya opened the back door, and the Montana air came in cold and clean through the kitchen, and he went out into it with the patient, deliberate pleasure of a dog that is exactly where it belongs, and she stood in the doorway with her coffee and watched him, and felt something that she had spent 3 years trying to locate and had begun to stop expecting, which was the particular quiet of a life that is working the way it is supposed to work. Sometimes the most powerful person in a room is the one who has been sitting quietly in the corner for 40 minutes, watching, waiting for the moment when waiting becomes the wrong thing and action becomes the only thing. God does not always place authority where we expect to find it. Sometimes he places it in a wool jacket in Seat 3A on a Tuesday morning flight, in a man who flies commercial because he believes his sailors deserve the same things he demands, and who stands up not to show what he is, but because a woman who gave this country 8 years of her life is being asked to sit down for the last time. And he has lived too long and seen too much to let that happen quietly. Rank does not make a person great. What makes a person great is what they do with it when no one who can hold them accountable is watching. The Admiral knew this. He had always known it. He simply stood up. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded today that power used rightly is one of the most beautiful things in this world. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this. Have you ever watched someone use their position to protect someone who had no protection? Your story may be the one that restores someone's faith in this country tonight. If you believe in stories of courage, dignity, and the quiet authority of people who do what is right because it is right, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you the courage to stand up in whatever aisle you find yourself in, because someone, somewhere, is still sitting with their chin up, waiting to see if anyone will.